Okay, I think we can get started. There are a couple of 3 or 4 people that will be recovered very soon that are coming, but I think we could begin. They will be here in a couple of minutes, I guess. Okay, this morning we start with 2 examples of assessment of media pluralism on a regional basis that obviously is connected with the discussion we had yesterday. And so we see 2 specific programs, and first speaker will be Julie Desmet for the media on monitoring in the Flanders. Julie.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Julie, and normally my boss would be here. That's Professor Schifanoia, but he's a year on a sabbatical in the States, so I'm lucky to be here instead of him. I'm here to present to you our policy center, which is called the Media Policy Research Center. It was in the beginning Media Mon, but we thought that this name was not very good, so we changed it in just Media. Who are we? We exist since January 2012, so it's just the beginning actually. And we are a consortium of around 20 researchers, also Peggy is one of them, from 4 universities in Flanders. We got Brussels, Ghent, Leuven and Antwerp. And we're all doing research in the field of news and mass media. We are funded and commissioned by the Flemish government. And as you may know, in Belgium we don't have one media landscape, but they are separated in 2 cultural media landscapes. That's why I'm now telling you something about Flanders and not about the whole country. Our fundamental research covers the whole news cycle. And the first part in the news cycle is the production of news, how the journalists select and product the news. And we're specifically doing research about gatekeeping news sources, alternative news sources, desk-based journalism, etc. A second part is a news content, and we're doing more specifically research on diversity, news quality, professionalism. And a third part is a news consumption, so how the media users consume the news with which tools, etc. And we're doing research about user generated contributions to the online news and media literacy. For all this research, we organize 3 big data gathering moments. For the first part of production, news production, we are conducting a journalist survey, and it is a survey that already existed. We already did 3 surveys, and so now it's a continuation of it. The news content. Before our center, so before 2012, I worked during 2 years on another project which analyzed specifically broadcast news, who monitored it. And now that project is embedded in our research center. And I will tell you more about this methodology we use, and I will show you some graphs about the broadcast news in Flanders, because we have already all the data available from 2003 until 2011. But this analysis will be kept up to date until the end of the project, 2015. What is new is that we will also monitor the newspaper news from 2003 until 2015. So at the end of the project, there will be a big database. For the third part, news consumption, we will survey the media users, and we will ask questions about which tools they use to inform themselves and how is their news consumption proportioned, and if they are online or more watching traditional media, etc. Our target groups are the Flemish government. We want to inform their media policy, and also inform and enrich the debate in the general public, so the public opinion. We want to enrich political and public debate about news content and media literacy. And we reach the general public by means of the News Monitor, which is a report, a newsletter, mostly around 10 pages about key findings of our research. And then it's widely disseminated. We already sent out 9 news monitors in the other projects before 2012, and we always got a lot of media attention, and we enriched the public and political debate. So it's a good tool to reach the public. Now something more about the part of the news content of the broadcast news. Our methodology is a quantitative analysis of the population data. So we analyze all broadcast news on prime time of 7 p.m. Of the public and the commercial broadcaster in Flanders. The analysis is at the level of one news item. So in our database of the last 9 years, we have more than 6,000 news broadcasts and more than 120,000 news items which are coded. We work with job students. They look at the news manually and they code it into a database. And here is a list of our variables we distinguish. Of course, so all these variables are coded for one news item, so one subject in the news. Of course, we encode the date, the medium, whether it is the public or the commercial broadcaster, the amount of items, headlines, item order, so whether it is the first, the second, or the 10th news item, the duration of the item to weight everything, the name of the journalist in order to, for example, do statements about the potential influence of the news, the potential influence of the gender of the journalist on news content, the media source, whether the news item uses external sources to make the news, a brief item description, and issue codes. We have a list of more than 300 issue codes, which can be attributed to the issue. So, for example, we have 20 issues for the issue crime, or 40 codes for politics, etc. Of course, we also encode the countries. Also actors. Actors are all institutions, organizations, companies who are mentioned in the news. Also all the people who are mentioned and who are quoted in the news. We analyze the name and the function of that actor in the news. And if it's a person, we also encode the origin of the name, whether it is Belgium, it sounds Belgium or not, the skin color, gender, language, quote duration to weight, everything, and whether the actor is disabled or not. This is quite boring, this slide, so I thought I would bring some graphs here in this presentation to make it a bit more vivid and attractive. I have some graphs. Yeah, we have a lot of research, but I picked some interesting graphs. I will show you a graph about the most important issues in the Flanders broadcast news. A graph about the geographical context. I will focus also on the issue politics, and a graph about the actors who are quoted in the news. A first graph. These are the results of the last 9 years. We talk a lot about politics, which is the blue line. Here, politics is broadly defined. It is political organization, parties, unions, but also elections, war, peace, international context, diplomacy, etc. But I will focus more on politics later in this presentation. And then we see the red line, which is the results for crime. It's quite high also, and more on the commercial than on the public broadcaster, but this is not in the graph. The green line is the results for economics and finance, and it's quite interesting to see that since the crisis in 2008, it's higher, nearly 10%, and it stays high in 2009, then it drops down in 2010, and then again, the second eruption of the crisis, 2011, it's 11%. This graph is about geographical context of the news. We distinguish between three contexts here. We have the domestic news, so this is purely Belgian news. It's more than half of our total news, which is about a Belgian context. Mixed news is Belgian news with a reference to one or more foreign countries, and foreign news is purely foreign news without a reference to Belgium. And now we see the green line, foreign news, that in 2003 there was, it was quite high, 2005. Then it dropped down slightly. There was less and less media attention to foreign news, but then again in 2011, because of the Arab Spring and the financial crisis worldwide, it's again a big issue. Then a geographical graph about politics. So it's the issue politics, and then shown if it's European, foreign, or domestic politics. The blue line is European politics. So it's not that high. It's, for example, in 2004, 2% of the total news, so it's not a lot. But then again, in 2011, we see that the European level is more and more important, especially on the financial issue. Then the red line, foreign politics, it was very high in 2003 because of the Iraq war. Then it went down, and again 2011 because of the Arab Spring, it's again booming. The domestic politics results, the green line, they're highly correlated with elections. We have a lot of elections in Belgium, as you may see here. 2003, it was the federal elections. 2004, the regional elections and European. 2005, no elections. You see that in the graph. 2006, local elections. 2007, again, federal. 2008, no elections. 2009, again, European and local elections. 2010, regional. 2010, we had our government, the federal government collapsed, and again, elections. Then it took us more than a year to form a government, and you see that also in the results. we talk a lot about politics. This is a graph focused on the elections of 2010, the federal elections. Week 0 here is the week of the election day. And then we distinguish 3 periods, pre-campaign, campaign, and post-campaign period. You see then here about half of the news in the week of the elections is about the elections. This graph is also about the elections and what is the speaking time for the politicians per political party. And it's quite interesting to see that in the pre-campaign period, the Christian Democratic Party and the Liberal Party, which are then in government, federal government, they have a lot of media attention, so they have a lot of opportunity to speak in the news. During the campaign period, which is 6 weeks before election day, we see that the results are more balanced. And then post-campaign period, the Christian Democrats, N-VA, which is the party of Bert de Wever, the Flemish nationalist politician, who, when the elections, he got more and more media attention. Then this is a last graph about the proportion of the types of actors interviewed in the news. We distinguish in this graph between three actors. We have the elite actors, which are persons who are interviewed because of their professional function, because they are famous to the general public, etc. We think about politicians, company leaders, celebrities, etc. Witnesses, the second bar, is an actor who is unknown to the general public, but he's interviewed because he has some unique or specific information. For example, a witness of an accident, or a victim of an accident, or a relative of a celebrity or something. The vox pop are the people in the street who are interviewed because of their opinion. So it doesn't matter if the journalist picks that person or another person to be interviewed. You see that the elite persons are nearly 70%, so they are a lot interviewed in the news. And the vox pop around 23. If we look at the proportion of women and men, we see that in the elite position, the women get 13% of the nearly 70% for elite persons, so it's not balanced. And then a question that arises here is whether these results are a consequence of that there are simply less women in society executing an elite position, or whether it is the journalist who prefers to interview a man or give more opportunities to men to give a chance to a person to speak in the news. My answer is both, because it's reality that there are less women in elite positions in society. But if we look at the results for vox pop, we see that a vox pop is a person in the street, so actually there is a 50-50 chance to be interviewed in the news. So, but though the journalist prefers to pick up to select a man than a woman, because men have 13% chance to get in the news and women 10. So there is some unbalance here. That was my last graph. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julie. I think we'll listen also to the second presentation on the same theme and more in general, and then we'll discuss both of them. So it will be Bernd Malzanini from the Commission on Concentration in the Media in Germany that will talk us about how the Commission on Concentration in the Media analyzes the situation.
Thank you very much. First, I want to introduce myself. My name is Bernd Malzanini, if you've seen here, and I am the managing director of the, we are saying in German, KEC. There's an abbreviation for Commission in Germany. In English, we can say roundabout Commission on Concentration on the Media. And I haven't not prepared such a nice presentation as my colleague, but I will tell you something about our work. And in former years, we have also made some studies, for example, with Peggy concerning cable network structures in several countries. Years ago, but I remember well on this. Yes, what are we doing? Firstly, I want to give you a short overview of the mission of the KEC and the regulatory framework concerning the ensurety of plurality. Then I will speak about the data, what we know and what we don't know. Finally, I will report to you on the German experience in media concentration law and the question, what problem do we want to solve in the future? Let me first say a few words about the mission of the CAC. The CAC is a special authority to enforce ownership rules in the area of nationwide private television in Germany. The CAC is responsible for the monitoring of the media landscape, and it is responsible to ensure diversity of opinion. So, any application to grant or renew a broadcasting license for, and this is important to say, only for nationally transmitted program must be forwarded to the CAC. In these procedures, as well as in the case of any change in broadcasters' ownership structures, the Commission examines whether a company is able to exercise a so-called predominant power over public opinion by its media activities. What is this, and how do we find out if we suppose such a predominant power over public opinion? So let me say a few words about the regulatory framework. The media concentration regulation of broadcasting in Germany is based on a viewer rating approach. The idea behind this approach is the television is, and we are saying will remain, in the foreseeable future, the dominant and leading medium in our society. Now you may ask, what about the usage of online media? Yes, I will give you the latest figures. Number one on the use of media in Germany is television. According to a recent study by German public broadcasters on the daily use of media in Germany, every German over 14 years spent an average time of 220 minutes per day watching only TV. This is nearly 4 hours a day, every person, every day. 187 minutes allotted to the radio. The internet follows in third place, just 83 minutes online every day. This justifies, at least for the next years, a specific concept of media concentration control specifically tailored to broadcasting and TV. So, according to our rules, a company is allowed to broadcast an unlimited number of nationwide television programs, unless it is thereby able to exercise this magic predominant power over public opinion. The relevant threshold here is a viewer rating of 30%. A dominant opinion-forming position will be legally assumed with any viewer rating equal or above this limit. The same shall apply if the company reaches viewer ratings of 25% and holds a dominant position in a so-called related media-relevant market. These related media-relevant markets are, for example, the markets of advertising, radio, the press, broadcasting rights, technical and administrative services, the means of transmission, and last but not least, the new media services. We will come back to this point later. Let me now say a few words about the data. As everybody knows, data gets important. What do we know and what we don't know at the moment? In the year 2005, the CAC launched a media database, which you can recall free of charge on our website. The media database contains information on ownership structure of companies in the nationwide television, radio, press, and in the online sector. The CAC has also a monitoring and reporting duty concerning the concentration in the private broadcasting sector. So the CAC periodically publishes a report on the development of the television offering, the audience shares, on the development of groups of broadcasters, and, important, on links between television broadcasters and other media-relevant related markets. What concerns our experience, I want to say, all things considered, we have a quite complete overview of ownership structures and the concentration development in the German media market. Regarding that, what Damien asked yesterday, do we have a useful concept? I would say, yes, we have. However, the reach of the internet has increased, while that of television has diminished, especially in younger age groups. With this growing relevance of the internet, the question arises of what role the online media plays in the process of opinion formation. In addition, it must be asked how far single players gain or have already gained influence on public opinion. Prompted by the growing influence of online media, the CAC has commissioned a report on this issue. This report was published in 2010, and it is titled "The Meaning of the Internet in the Context of Securing Plurality of Opinion." The report can be downloaded also free of charge from our website. And my apologies, it is only in German, but you find there a short summary in English language. It's a very interesting study. It was made by two professors from the University of Münster and of the University of Dortmund. To keep a long story short, focusing on providers of relevant journalistic services, one finds a considerable dominance of internet spin-offs of traditional mass media. So you can find the biggest printed news magazines, such as Spiegel and Focus, also in so-called online editions. These spin-offs tend to recycle content from other media. As a result, what happens is that the additional offering is often not more of the same. But by extending their content into the online market, conventional media companies significantly strengthen their impact on the public opinion. So it is not surprising that the major German newspapers and magazines, such as I told, Spiegel, Focus, Stern, and Bild, are also the leaders of the top 10 information websites. So, due to their dominance with regard to professional journalistic offerings, the traditional media companies have altogether an outstanding impact on opinion formation in the online world in comparison to other internet content providers. In the interplay between different media lies new potentials for power over public opinion. What we are discussing in Germany is the question to what extent we may compare the traditional television channels with some online phenomena as communication platforms such as YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. The key question concerns the following three features of a medium. First, we are asking how current is the medium? Always the question, is it as current as the television? Second question, is there a scope of effect? That means how many people are reached by this media, which we take into concern. And the third question is, has the medium a so-called suggestive power, such as television has? Under these aspects, at the moment, we are discussing that an effective media concentration law, also your question, is this a useful concept? Must take these developments into account, of course. From our point of view, the securing of plurality requires an integrated approach which takes cross-media phenomena more and more into consideration. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Bernd. Well, I think that we have seen two different ways to, if you want, to measure also under different, probably with different purposes. This second presentation is telling us a how it works, a Commission on Control of Concentration, and how is facing the new questions of the influence of new media. So it's interesting to see, to discuss how older limits could be adapted or should change. How can they take account of these new situations, if this new situation is changing or not the reality. Well, the actually presentation on the Flanders looks like a strong ground digging work on all the news in a way. So it's interesting to see what really is the idea of the finalization of these activities. So these are the points on which let's have open a little bit of debate on these two ideas.
This is more on the second presentation. I thought the first was really excellent and fascinating. A couple of points. Well, one of the things that fascinates me about the German framework is that it doesn't really give priority to the notion of pluralism. The concept of Meinungsmacht and power over public opinion is really what's taken into account, this key criterion for approval of mergers and change in broadcast ownership. But I'm interested in the measurement. You said that there is actually the rule is a concern with a more than 30% audience share in broadcasting. In television. Nationwide television. And could you say a little bit more about how press ownership is taken into account? And what I'm also interested in is how you deal with, do you make assumptions about differences between different platforms and their different influence over public opinion? Because one of the things that we find if we look at the system, we've just been looking in a paper with Rachel at the measurement systems used, the equivalent systems in the UK, the difficulty is always cross-platform comparisons and making assumptions, because time exposure to a newspaper is not the same as time exposure to the television, which is very often in the background, and also the methodologies, some of which are self-reported, subject to systematic error, and some of which are actually measured by a piece of kit in a large sample in a living room, are extremely robust. Those methodologies are very different. So could you say a little bit how you deal with those differences across platforms?
That is the key question here, how to assess at the moment, or how to use this extremely television-centered media law for these new developments. When you're mentioning the press, we first have to look at the viewer rating. That's always the point of view. And we have this first threshold that concerns only the viewer rate. I mean, if you have 30%, we have assumed this power over public opinion. But we have also a second threshold that is 25%. And when a broadcasting company reaches this 25% threshold, we take also into account the activities of this company, for example, in this media-relevant market, the press. And then the question is how to assess these activities. And when we want to say the approach of our model is 100% is the maximum value for the television, we have to decide as a commission. This is not my decision. Our commission is consisted of 12 experts in these things. And we are always discussing these issues. How can we compare the role of the press, the role of the internet, the role of the radio to the role of the television? And in a former decision of the CAC, when we did not allow a merger between the biggest German newspaper company, Springer, with the second biggest television company, Pro7 that was in 2006. Then we tried to find a measurement to compare this opinion power of television with this other media. And we said, for example, for the press, for the daily press, for the newspaper, we take in account 2/3 of the power of opinion of the television. At this time, it was...
for equivalent time.
Yeah. Yes.
It's time exposure.
Yes, yes. And this changes always. At this time, 2006...
sorry, just to clarify, if you have 1 hour of television and 1 hour... To clarify, 1 hour of television and 1 hour of newspaper, you weight the television viewing more?
Yes, of course, of course, of course.
Right. But taking into account...
That depends also of these 3 criteria, of these three features that I told you. That comes from our constitutional court. He has defined these 3 criteria, how current is the medium, and so you have to see the television is the most current medium. Yes, it is always up to date. The second question is there a scope of effect? How many people are reached by the medium? And so you would say television you can receive in every household, on every place in the country, at every time. But a newspaper, you have to go to the shop to buy it. And one buys a newspaper and perhaps 2 or 3 other persons are using the same newspaper too, yes? But it is not easy to find here a comparison between this media. But we said in this special case, in 2006, especially with the focus of this very, very strong position of the strongest Springer newspaper, Bild, perhaps you know it all here on the table, we found it at this moment correct or justable to say the total value of this newspaper is around about 2/3 of the television. Today, perhaps we could say the role of the television, of the newspapers, of the print, especially in this case, is not more so important as it was at this time, because you have the same newspaper today as an online medium. You find all these newspapers and magazines as an online edition. And then we have to take into account this third feature, the third criterion, has this medium a suggestive power? And that depends also from the comparison between television and this new medium. 2006, we had in the internet not a lot of moved pictures. We had a lot of fixed text only without these motion pictures. And today, you would say, I would say, when we assessed in 2006 the internet or some online media with half of the value of the television. Today it is much more, but that also depends of the content of the online medium. What people is using in online media. What is online media? Is it file sharing? Has file sharing any effects on opinion, of public opinion? Or when you are using a newspaper, or when you are using a broadcaster that you can see via the internet, I think it is the same if you are looking to your television, watching to your television, or if you see the same program on your notebook. I would say that is the same value. So you have always to find the difference between, and that is quite complicated. And it must be flexible, yes? You have always to take into account the development on these markets. And so we are demanding for a useful concentration law that it is flexible, that it has no fixed limits, that the lawmaker is not saying to us, print has the value of half of television or something like this, or online media, because this is always in movement.
Okay, we have okay.
Just a simple clarification. I understand the different weighting between, say, broadcast and print and so on. Do you also differentiate within the media? Because clearly an hour spent watching news and current affairs will have more public opinion relevance than an hour watching football or a talent show. Is the model also take that into account, or is that too complicated?
Too complicated. We are discussion now concerning online media. What is the content? But the approach of our television concentrated law makes no difference. It makes no difference if you are watching a sport program or if you are watching a news program.
So is the share of the viewer time that you...
Yes,
yeah.
only this.
Okay. Okay, audience.
Only this.
I would like to put a question on the table whether the distinction radio, TV, newspapers, internet is a good distinction, because as you mentioned yourself, it doesn't make a huge difference whether people watch the news on their TV screen in the living room or on their tablet or on their laptop. So internet is just a platform, a distribution means like you have satellite and cable and terrestrial networks, so I'm not so sure whether internet as a separate medium is an approach that we can still follow. I don't know. I just wanted to put this on the table to see if somebody has a start of an answer.
A couple of questions. One is related to the previous one, and is when you put together newspaper and television, did you think that sometimes could be useful to consider in television just the newscast time? Obviously, if you compare a national newspaper, the influence on public opinion of a national newspaper, you have to take into account the news and actual program, but probably the fiction is less important. Sure, it's important to consider all the television because all the television is influenced, but sometimes can be useful. And the second question is, how do you consider pay television? Do you include the audience that looks at pay television and the over-the-top TV in the total audience over which to consider the 30 and 25% threshold for the concentration? And finally, a quick remark over Peggy. The question Peggy posed was very important. It's very important, but for the moment, I think that if you consider over the internet the time and the page views devoted to news or current affair, the dimension is really very, very low. And so it is becoming a very important problem, but we have some years in front of us to discuss it. Because if you look at the internet, you find a huge consumption, but consider that if you keep out mail, social network, and you put your attention over news and current affair, it's really some minutes a day, so it's 100 times less than television. And the final remark over the comparison between television and newspaper, in some way I feel that, on the contrary, you must weight newspaper more than television if you consider television as a whole. That is, for a public opinion point of view, half an hour spent on a newspaper is more than half an hour spent on television. So, if you consider a public opinion perspective, but I don't know, could be sometimes.
I'll take some questions, comments. Federica.
Just a methodological clarification from Julie. I saw that on the news production part, you were having a journalist survey. And I was wondering what is the definition of journalists that you take, because in that sense it would limit, because I know that Belgium share with Italy legal definition that is defined what is professional journalism and what is not professional journalism. So in that sense, would you also include an activity-based definition, that is whoever produce news content and that provides for public opinion, or do you just limit your survey to professional journalists, so those who are registered or are, well, comply with the requirements defined by law. That is just a clarification at that point.
Let's take a final question, and then I'll give you the floor back to the speakers.
I think that what our German colleague exposed is very interesting, and I would stress the importance of working on flexibility, because I think this is the core problem, because I'm following what Peggy says. I'm not so sure, Marco, how many years we have in front of us before the system is changing. Let me give you just the example of my son, 24 years old. He doesn't own a television screen, but he watches television. So how do you measure it? And this is the future. How many years? I agree that television is still the dominant medium, but the situation is changing very, very quickly. So I don't know how this system of monitoring can be applied in 2 years or 3 years. I mean, they will change very, very quickly.
Okay. The question.
Yes, always starting from the interesting Peggy's remark. I wanted to say that on one hand we have, through the internet we can consume TV and radio. So we have to consider that the internet consumption is not media consumption itself, but it's also used to consume traditional media. And on the other hand, with the new connected TVs, we are going to have other traditional paper media, for example, entering into TV screens. So we are going to have widgets allowing you to watch newspapers on your TV screens. So I wanted to ask Berne, how in Germany are you considering this converging process and in measuring the concentration in media? The fact that you have on one hand TV and radio consumed on the internet, and on the other hand newspapers or paper media consumed on TV.
Well, we give floor to answer to the speaker. I want just to add for Julie, if probably would be interesting also, at least I understand that you say that your research should inform Flemish politicians in a way, or Flemish government. I would like to understand more how you channel in the end all this information, and what would be the instrument to do something. And for Bernd, I wanted to only to remark that sometimes we love numbers, so 30%, 25 plus connected markets and so on. But I was wondering if when you ended your speech saying, okay, but then we'll have to have flexibility. We don't want the parliament to give numbers, to give us to rigid because things are changing. You were also thinking to the fundamental numbers, or you were also only talking about the spread between newspaper and the weights between newspaper and news? I want to understand how much flexibility you want. Okay, Julie.
Okay, I maybe first answer your question. Actually, it's the team of the University of Ghent who is conducting this journalist survey. So I don't know a lot about this. I know just a little. And I know in the last 3 surveys that they did, they just took the professional journalists into account. And I think, the survey will be conducted in 2013. And I think they're considering also interviewing other... I don't know if they will interview bloggers, for example, but maybe I will tell them that it's they have to take it into
just
account.
Following Peggy's remark regarding traditional media and new media. If you take into account also new media, you have to understand whether this legal definition of journalist that is not so shared in other European countries is still valid or not. Because if you distinguish between journalists that are part of a system and non-journalists, then you could really miss a part of the word that is still that is growing. That is just one element.
Yeah, and to answer your question, I'm glad Peggy's here because actually her team will translate our research in policy recommendations. So that's how we are going to do it. And we have monthly meetings with the government, and we explain things. And
the opposition as well?
No. but we do also research for the parliament. If there are questions in parliament, then we answer them, and we are also part of the debate. So, no.
Thank you. You wanted to?
Yes, thank you. Not easy to find an answer to all these questions, but I find there was a red file. And I will begin with the last question here of Pierluigi on my left. How much flexibility do you want, was your question. Yeah. And I would say as much as possible. But you have to know we are not in a political free room. And in our political discussions, especially in a state, in a federal state as Germany, with 16 states, with 16 several meanings, what have we to control media concentration control with very strong cities as Munich and Berlin and Hamburg and Cologne, with strong companies with much influence on politics. We have this discussion since 16 years. Since 16 years ago, our law changed into this viewer rating approach, and with this quite flexible approach. And I want to say it is the right approach. On the other side, companies are always demanding, please, politics, give us fixed limits, that we are knowing what we have to do in the future and something like this. But I think in a flexible world with so much changement, especially in new media, it is not the right way to say we will fix a law that is tomorrow a law from yesterday. To the question, your question, Giovanni, no, it was from Paolo. How long will last this system? I think this goes in the same direction. And it was a question of Marco. What are we doing when we reach this threshold? It is not so that when a company reaches a threshold of 30% with activities, for example, which are not so influent for public opinion, that we are saying it is now our duty to withdraw, for example, a license. It is only an assumption, yes? It is only an assumption. And the company is able to tell us what we are doing is only, for example, to broadcast sport events, or we are printing only magazines for children and for women and all these things. And so it is possible also to have here a flexible, to give a flexible response of a threshold of 30%. Yes, it lies in the hand of the company to tell us what they are doing is not so important for public for the influence of public opinion. And so also in this way, I find it is a useful model. It is open to all sides, and it has, from my point of view, a future. And it depends always of the political situation in our country, if it will change or if it will last. And my prognosis for the future is it will last at least for 1 or 2 years.
Thank you. We move now to the, we put in the program, the discussion, we wanted to have a look at the demand side of media pluralism. It is an important, slightly different issue. As on this, we have two presentations today. The first from Judith Raufer from the University of Edinburgh on the citizens' empowerment of media pluralism, the opportunity of transparency and the risk of control. Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I usually start my talks with certain caveats, and I think today's no exception, because I am actually a bit of an intruder in this gathering, because I'm not a media lawyer. I am an IT and internet lawyer, and so this last session has actually been incredibly interesting for me. I've given a presentation at a workshop that Rachel organized in December for the Media LM project on transparency, and I think that's probably what got me here. I have an idea. This is very largely what I said in December, but I've sneakily incorporated a little bit more stuff this morning, depending on what I heard yesterday, because some of the stuff that I heard yesterday was very interesting. I think the other reason why I need to give this caveat is because everything I say now probably has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because I am very, very clear that I live in a bubble. My experience is from the way I actually use media, the way I use news, the way I gather, select, create news, and so on, is probably different from that of many other people. And from that point of view, it is, as I say, has to be taken with a slight pinch of salt. Right. Okay. So my first heretic statement, which might come as a surprise, is that I do not actually believe in transparency. The reason for that is largely that I am specializing in online privacy. And that in the area of internet law, internet governance, and online privacy, we have really quite big issues with transparency. But I come to that a little bit later. The other thing that I would like to talk about is that I am supposed to be talking about the demand side of things. Now, I've taken a lot of leeway with that, because demand for me, I've sort of basically redefined demand as citizen. As the people who would normally consume media. But I'm not actually going to talk about those people consuming media. Instead, what I would like to talk about is how else these people come into the fray of media pluralism. When we talk about transparency of or in the media, I think there are various areas we can look at, and I'll sort of tick them off a little bit. First of all is, of course, transparency of media ownership, and Peggy has shown us yesterday with the monitors that is part of what we're trying to achieve. We want transparency about whether or not our regulators are independent, by making transparent their affiliations and the process that they're using when they're regulating. We want our policymakers to be transparent in their affiliations. And I'm not sure how many of you are watching what's going on in the UK at the moment, but of course, both of those last two are a massive issue in the UK at the moment, because, well, our regulator in the media, the PCC, is all but, facing its demise, if it isn't indeed. It has been abandoned, hasn't it? So, for not doing its job properly. And our policymakers' affiliations with the media, well, they are the subject of the Leveson inquiry, which has just very recently unearthed this really interesting thing about Jeremy Hunt, the Culture Secretary, having made up his mind maybe before time, shall we say, if we want to be nice about the whole thing. But we also, and this is actually what I would want to focus on in this talk, we also need transparency about new and social media, and particularly about new and social media governance, and that's probably what most of my talk's going to be about. But before that, and moving on to yesterday, and what I learned yesterday, which was fascinating, is the whole transparency aspect of the monitors. And the one thing that struck me most, for me, as I say, not being a media lawyer and learning a lot in half a day, was that these monitors are designed, if I got this correctly, to make public the state of pluralism, so that we all know what's going on. We all know what the ownership is about. We all know what what parity of information is, and all of that sort of stuff. Do we talk enough about disabled people, about men and women, about the political parties, and all of that sort of stuff? So we have all of this sort of as an idea, but then the question that was sort of asking itself in my head is, well, what is this all for? And the one sentence that Peggy said yesterday that struck me most is, yeah, we put it all out there, and somebody asked, well, what do people now do with it? And she was just like, nothing. They don't. And that is sort of my problem with transparency in a nutshell, because the problem is, of course, the objective of all this monitoring. The problem is, of course, the objective of all this making public of the information. And I think there is somewhere where we're suffering from an immense optimism that is possibly not warranted. Because we have this feeling that if only people knew all of the wonderful and bad things that are happening, they'd surely go out and do something about it. Well, You know, the influence, they basically the objective of monitoring as influencing those who could do something about it, which would probably be, okay, who would that be? The regulators, okay? If the regulators knew just how bad things are, they obviously have to change their ways. Well, the regulators are subject to all sorts of other, you know, pressures and possibilities, and if they are at the heart of the problem, then I think, you know, they themselves are not going to be spurred into action. The policymakers, same things. I mean, we have all these issues about the affiliations and who is their real paymaster and what do they want and all of that sort of stuff. So just having the information out there is probably not going to work. So who are we addressing this to, as Peggy said? The civil society organizations, the citizens themselves. You know, we are trying to create the sort of public outrage that would spur the other two into action. So the problem, of course, is that these, we are now relying on a group of people that we have absolutely no control over. We're assuming and hoping for the best, but we may actually have to live with a completely different set of, you know, scenarios. Moving on to social media, new and social media. I think one of the things, and it's been a bit better tomorrow, actually just this morning, just Federica said before about the blogs. I think that was the first time when we actually talked about the little people, not as consumers, but as creators. And I think this is one of the things that maybe where I'm saying I live in a bubble, but where I think we need to think about the future. And I couldn't put this on there, but I've brought my iPad. So I've brought a few things about this, because new and social media play increasingly a large role in the creation and the distribution of media, of news items in particular. And in the distribution, I mean the pre-selection and moving forward, the giving something more hits, more eyeballs, that sort of thing. And individuals are no longer just consumers of media. They are increasingly creating media, okay? And I've got a few examples for this when we look about citizens and online media. The first thing that is in my world, and that is me and, you know, all the geeks that I work with, what is perfectly normal now in the consumption and the creation of media is, let's start with the consumption. We look at an article in the Guardian online section. It is the Guardian online section, and I am one of those people who loves reading the paper in bed. I've got the Guardian delivered on a Saturday morning, and then my girlfriend and I fight over the sections. Now, we have a long-standing tradition of who gets which part first, but these days, actually, I don't have to wait, because I've got this, okay? So if she takes too long reading about something particular, I grab this and I start reading. So this is the first thing that has my media consumption has completely changed. The second thing that has completely changed is in The Guardian there is a columnist called Lucy Mangan, which we both find really funny, and it used to be enough for me to read Lucy Mangan's column on a Saturday morning. I don't do that anymore, because I actually now not only want to say what she has to say, but I want to see what everyone else has to say about what she has to say. So actually what we're now increasingly finding is the comment section on these online media, which actually make up a large part of the media consumption for the people. And I found this particular one, both because it's an article that really upset me last week, but also because it is a very good showcase for what I was just saying. The Guardian published an article, I'm not sure if you know, there's a big debate going on about introducing gay marriage in England at the moment, or in the UK. And the Catholic Church is very upset about this. So there's lots and lots of, you know, media coverage of this issue. And one of the things the Guardian published these last week was an article about the Catholic Church sending letters to all faith schools. Could they please ask all their pupils to sign the petition against gay marriage? Now that is actually something that, for me, I was just like, but it wasn't just me, because if you then scroll down on this thing, and this is not normal, I mean, you know, comments would have been expected, but this thing has 28 pages of comments, okay? And it took them something like 24 hours to get to 23 pages of comments. So the last 5 comments are actually the last 2 days. The first day generated 23 pages of comments. And I think that is something that we really have to take into account these days when we're talking about how people view media, because we're not just reading it, we're not just talking about it over the water cooler, we're talking about it so that everyone else in the world can see, millions of people can see this, okay? So that's the first thing I think we need to think about. The second, of course, is that we are increasingly adding our own perspective to this. And I see this with myself. I blog under a pseudonym, which I'm not going to disclose. And I use this blog partly for venting, but partly also when the lawyer in me gets the better of me for actual legal analysis. I use it to try out things. I use it to, for instance, analyze court cases or new statute or anything like that. And when I'm doing that, Sometimes when I then go onto the Guardian comments pages, I put a link into this. So I'm adding my own expertise, my own legal expertise on a particular issue to something where I would otherwise not have had any access to. I don't know the Guardian very well. You know, they would not know me, and it's not something that I would normally have. But I can put a blog link, a link in there to a blog post, and I have an immediate access to very, very many, large numbers of people who might actually then come and read my blog. More importantly, actually, or more obviously, we probably now can say that increasingly experts of one way or another are getting access, are getting official access to this. Another one that I quite like about this is this guy called Ben Goldacre, and that isn't actually him, but he's writing a blog. Oh, sorry, he's gone. Sorry. The Frankenstein isn't him, but the reason why he's used Frankenstein as an avatar is he's a medic, and he's basically in the business as a sideline to his day job of sort of deflating science myths in The Guardian. So whenever one of these things comes up, that red wine gives you cancer, he usually goes in, looks at the data, and basically tells you that it's all, you know, stupid and you shouldn't believe it. And this is somebody who, over time, has actually gained journalistic status. But he isn't a journalist, and he will never be a journalist. He is not in his day job a journalist. He's a medic, you know. He's a scientist. He's a researcher, and then, but he's got this inroad into media, and we're increasingly seeing that, I think. And the final thing, I think, is about selection. And I've just sort of tried to put this one up. This is actually yesterday morning's Twitter feed of my Twitter feed. And the reason why I'm putting this up in the morning is because this is how it happens. I get up, I switch on Twitter, and I now have a choice. I can either read The Guardian online myself, or I can just see what everybody else has already tweeted as interesting. Okay? And this is increasingly how I select what I read, because we are all inundated by media. So what the other people, I'm following a relatively small number of people because I don't want to be inundated. But what these 25 people that I follow actually read is, for me, an incredibly good filter, and an incredibly good pre-selection of what is probably of interest to me. I then add to that, I do put stuff around, but also I'm a Guardian girl, and I probably wouldn't go on the Daily Mail unless you force me. And sometimes somebody just blogs or tweets something that is on the Daily Mail, either for the outrageous factor or because for once they make a good point. And then I do get more pluralism of my own media consumption. And that has nothing to do with me. That has to do with the fact that I'm relying on other people to take this pre-selection for me. And I think this is one of the things that we really need to start taking into account, because we have issues coming out of that. It has an impact. It will have to have an impact on media regulation, because we are looking at media behavior of ordinary citizens that is completely ungoverned at the moment. And a lot of people, open internet people, digital rights campaigners, I'm looking at Damien because we're on the AC of the Open Rights Group, which is engaged in this sort of thing. And a lot of my techie friends will say, hands off, you lawyer people, we don't want any sort of regulation. But the problem, of course, is that we will face issues. And this is the old issue which a guy called Peter Swire a few years called the problem of elephant and mice. You can regulate a few behemoths in any one industry. You can regulate a lot of big companies or a few big companies. But the mice just go back into their holes and come back somewhere else, okay? So when you have millions and millions of media creators, you're looking at a completely different playing field. And I think this is something that we may have not yet properly embraced in our own understanding of media regulation and of plurality. This has good sides and bad sides. If we're looking at things that have happened in the UK over recent years, there is this Ryan Giggs thing, very bad side. Ryan Giggs was a footballer who had an affair. He got an injunction. The media was not actually allowed to talk about this affair. It popped up on Twitter, and immediately everybody knew, okay? So how do we deal with people who are completely and blatantly ignoring injunctions like that on Twitter? We have very strong regulatory objectives with relation to the disclosure of the identity of raped women. Media, established media are not allowed to mention them by name, to identify them. We had this issue recently where, again, a footballer, I don't know what this is for footballers, but a footballer basically was found guilty of raping a woman. The normal media restrictions on the woman's identity kicked in, and a Twitter storm broke out naming her and really basically harassing her and saying, she was a slut for doing it in the first place and she was drunk, and all the usual stuff that women who were raped get. And now they're getting it on Twitter. And it was in complete defiance of this rule that the media has to comply with, that they can actually not do this. On the other hand, we have Wikileaks. We are now finding out a lot of information that we might not find out if it weren't for people disclosing it. And I think this is the good side, and this is, of course, where the internet campaigners come in. They say, you don't restrict this. This is freedom of speech. This has given us much more access to much more information that would otherwise be, be swept under the carpet. So little people's contributions are changing the landscape, I think, is what I want to say. And in particular, what we have to look at is that they are doing this on platforms that are privately owned. Okay, so these contributions by the little people, they are regulated, but they're not regulated in the context that we're seeing at the, with the traditional media. We have a complete private governance of the little people media contribution. And that, I think, is something that we really, really have to start talking about, because the EULA reigns supreme, the end-user license of these platforms reigns supreme. And, I'm not saying that platform owners like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook, that they don't have a good point for, regulating, because they themselves are subject to laws. They themselves are subject to certain liabilities. But the problem, of course, is that they are passing these legal obligations on, their own legal obligations on to their users with knobs on. They do this belts and braces approach, and I'm a lawyer. I've worked for clients like this. I am writing these EULAs, and they will give my clients all rights to take down everything they don't like, and that's basically what happens. So we now have private media players who have no obligation to pluralism and no obligation to society for themselves. They have an obligation to shareholders and commercial profit. And all they want is to not be caught in the crossfire of things. All they want is to make money out of these people generating contract for which they can then sell advertising space. And they are really mostly not interested either way of, improving media pluralism or anything like that. So if anything slightly dodgy comes along, they're going to take it down. And these days, more and more, we're actually seeing architectural restraints. Architectural restraints, most of you might know this, in the discussion of regulatory modes, is the whole code thing. What you can't do in the first place can't go wrong. And the interesting, again, example I saw with this on The Guardian, for instance, was that I noticed with some surprise on Thursday, I think, was it? When was Murdoch in Levinson? Well, basically, when James Murdoch was interviewed in Levinson, and the whole, pardon my French, shit hit the fan with Jeremy Hunt and his affiliations and stuff like that, The Guardian closed the comment section for every single article that dealt with Hunt. Okay? So that was basically immediately a restriction on the contributions of the little people at that point in time, because they were too afraid, potentially, I don't know their reasons, but they were probably too afraid of generating something or allowing people to generate something that would put the Guardian in some sort of liability situation. So we're looking at a privatization of media governance, particularly in the digital arena, and I think this is something that we have to look about. So coming back to transparency, and I have to rush through this now. I know it's the new black. We have lots and lots of things. This whole idea that, as I say, if only people knew enough about stuff, they'd do something. Well, I actually think that's a complete crock, quite frankly, because as much as transparency is a good thing, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have it. Of course, we should know all of this, but I think our expectations of it are too high. This is my main issue, because transparency puts the user or the person on whom we then expect to do something about this at the focus of the discussion. And quite frankly, and this is probably me and my n=1 sort of thing, I don't do that. I do this in very rare cases that I specifically select when I have the time and nothing better to do. And I think this is pretty much the way most users view what they're doing. And we've seen this in lots and lots of different areas, because we've been there, this choice agenda, okay? If we give people choice, we're doing stuff. We have parental choice in Britain. We have parental choice in which school they want to send their children to. All the schools are very, very, keen on being good enough so that the parents choose me. Quite frankly, all the parents I've ever talked about said, all I want is a decent school close to where I live. I don't have to worry about it, and I know that my child learns enough and doesn't get, introduced to drugs. It's all I ever want. And the majority of parents actually do not want choice. They actually just want good provision. The same probably with regard to hospitals. We have this patient choice agenda in the UK. More and more pushed now by the increased privatization. Again, people just want a good doctor, a good hospital where they can get more than a 5-minute appointment when something's wrong, and that's all they ever need. They don't need to be able to say, this dentist is much better than that dentist. I mean, maybe in countries like Germany, we have a slightly different concept of doctors. I know that. My mum, tries out dentists and stuff like that. But actually in the UK, they're reasonably sensible about this whole thing. All they wanted was, just have one good one that they can rely on. I can say this. I'm German myself. So basically, the reality of the choice agenda is really can be described by, pardon me, but I have a life. Okay, there are other things I'd rather do than reacting to information that you shove in my face with the expectation that I solve the worries of the world. And I think we can really see this. There are some things, you know, Damien and I talked about it last night. We had this transparency agenda in relation to net neutrality. Net neutrality is this issue of, can an ISP slow you down? Can they traffic manage? Can they sell you a better connection or a worse connection? Can they, you know, give benefit or priority to some traffic over others? And of course, if you file sharing, you might find yourself pretty much on standstill. And basically the direct letter response to this has been, well, people need to know, okay? They need to know that their ISP is allowed to do that. Well, and then what? What are they going to do about it? You know, they cannot really make any changes. So transparency in this context doesn't work at all. We have this whole idea with transparency with online behavioral advertising that I spent much of last year talking about. You know, again, the industry is arguing, well, if people know that we're doing this, they're going to be fine with it. Actually, on the contrary, if people know about it, they're not very, very far from fine with it. But again, they're not so not fine with it that they actually do something about it. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about the trade-offs that we're going in for, if I need to have online targeted advertising in order to be able to use Facebook for free, I think about 90% of the population will opt for doing that. And transparency is not getting them anywhere. Because what we end up with, and this is the interesting thing from social media, what we end up with is giving users control to a bewildering extent. Somebody sort of identified the privacy settings of Facebook. And I know this because I'm not on Facebook. It was a very, very clear distinction, or very clear decision I made when it all started, but my girlfriend is. And my job in that whole thing is every 6 months, I think decreasing now to every 3 months because of the risk factor, I sit down and I redo her privacy settings. Because every 3 months, Facebook will have changed something that makes her original choice invalid. And every time I do this, it takes me 45 minutes. Okay? Now, the majority of people do not go online to spend 45 minutes ticking boxes. That's not what we do. So all this transparency, all this control, all this choice that we're given, it's not taken up. And I think in relation to media pluralism, this is something we really need to take in mind. So the real question that we need to ask ourselves is, and this is like, because I usually talk about this in the context of internet law, these are not your typical internet users. The people who say transparency is a good thing because they give me autonomy are the people who feel comfortable with doing that and have enough of a mindset and enough of an incentive and enough of an obsession to tinker with these things. These are the typical internet users. That is my mother, okay? My mother is a silver surfer. Her online behavior frightens me every day because she does things that I wouldn't want her to do, and whatever people tell me about being, trying to regulate the children's access to internet, I think people over 65 are exactly in the same risk group. Well, not to want to, not to want to insult anyone here, but my mom has taken to this medium like a fish to water, but she really doesn't know about computers. So, there is so much stuff happening. I could do an whole other talk about this. So the problem really is, what is the alternative to this transparency thing? And as I say, I'm not talking about transparency being a bad thing in itself. I just think we cannot impose all the expectations of the universe on transparency. So I really have said for a very long time, we need minimum standards in every area, and that I think means regulation. And that's where I'm sort of coming in with the German. Maybe this is because I'm German. We do believe this sort of thing. And of course, I'm a lawyer, I would say that. But when I say about minimum standards, I don't just talk about laws that tell people what they can and cannot do. There was this beautiful program in the 70s in Germany, which was called POGEL, politisches Gleichgewicht, political equality. And it was basically making fun of this idea that in German television in the early years, in the 70s or so, if you were talking about the Christian Democrats, you also immediately had to put another bit afterwards about the Social Democrats, okay? You had to try and give political equality about this whole thing. We still have a little bit of that, I think, haven't we? But it was much stronger than it used to be. of course, I'm not necessarily in favor of very specific laws that says that each party has a right to exactly the amount of time as it has a representation in parliament or something like that. But we have other ways of doing this. And I think what we really need is these minimum standards where we say, okay, this has to be done. And then what we also really need is enforcement, you know, proper enforcement. And as we have seen in the UK, the PCC potentially hasn't been that good, both in the minimum standards that it set down and in the way in which it had enforced it, because it was in the industry's pocket. And I think this is one of the ways that we need to think about this. So thanks for that. That's pretty much the end of it, I think. So I think what I want to close with is transparency is a wonderful thing. And we're currently trying to find out, particularly with the online scenario, how we are going to deal with these new issues. But I would really urge caution against this whole idea of just putting the information out there and hoping that everything's going to be hunky-dory, because I just think that's unrealistic and it's not going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Now we'll take the second speech, and then probably we'll stop for a coffee break, and then we'll have some discussion, and then we move to the roundtables. So we have Susan Nikolchev of the European Audiovisual Observatory.
There's a PowerPoint. Is it an agreement or against?
You have it already?
Can't see from here. I think this discussion with Crystal. But of course, he's a co-author.
It should be this one.
Like Florence?
Yeah, I think it could be that.
I think he's slightly more pro-transparency than I am, but I'm just
maybe somebody else had the same ingenious way of marking it, then you don't find.
What is it? Yeah.
Could be also the workshop.
No, that's mine. That's mine. No, yes, no. Presentation.
There's one up there.
That's mine.
Oh, that's yours.
Do you have it on the
I have it.
Okay, put it again.
This is yours, yeah? Yes, please. Thanks a lot.
Yep, I'll do it.
But, I mean, while we're trying to find that, I'm very, very tempted to make this now a transparency discussion.
No, wait a second. Okay. Wait a second. Yeah. Now it is.
Now go. There is one that says presentations. There, the folder.
Presentations.
And there should be somewhere.
Florence. Down there.
This one. Okay. And this is the right button, I guess.
Yes.
So, as I said, I'm extremely tempted to just continue on this notion on transparency. And in a second, you will also a little bit see why. Because actually, we do believe in transparency at the observatory. And if you see, I've put out a couple of the products, you know, to make information public, which was another notion that you brought. And here it says, and this is about our institution, transparency through information. We celebrated our 10th year's anniversary. It was, guess about what? Transparency. But I will not do too much of that, but still I will come back. I want to briefly tell you who we are, because I think it's important. We had a lot of talk about the EU, and I want to make clear that you understand we are not EU. We are different, and we have a lot of things in common still. I want to tell you that even so I'm invited to speak about a particular project which really deals with pluralism and the topics of the workshop. We are on an ongoing basis providing information on media pluralism, and I want to tell you how and why. And then finally, I'm going to present, of course, the very project. Now, what's the observatory? We were founded in 1992. Actually, we celebrate our 20th anniversary this year. We are part of the Council of Europe, and we are a special part of the Council of Europe in that we are an enlarged partial agreement. That means not all Council of Europe member states are member with the observatory, but 38 are, because these are the 38 members who thought that dealing in particular with information on the audiovisual sector made sense, and so they got together. And we are an enlarged partial agreement because actually, and that's where the EU comes in, the EU is a member of the observatory, represented through the Commission and through one of the colleagues actually of Susanne, he's sitting here. And our raison d'etre is, now here comes transparency. We shall increase transparency for the audiovisual sector. Now, how do we do that? We gather information, so the second bad thing, which we do as much as we can, and that's information on the audiovisual industry in Europe. And that I want to stress because we're here in the section of on demand. So we are catering primarily to the demand of the industry, the audiovisual industry, which we perceive has well a need for information, also really wants to have transparency, except often, unfortunately, when it's transparency about their own affairs. So we see that there are also limits to what you get and what you can do. Now, the observatory is structured in two departments. One, and that is the one I'm heading, collects information on law, on everything, which are legal developments relevant to the audiovisual sector. And the other department collects information on the markets and on financing questions. And we then use this information in publications or for filling our databases or for making all contributions like I do today. In any event, the goal is to collect, to digest a little bit beforehand so that it becomes easier to understand for our clients, and then to really give it to the public. And sometimes a lot of what we have is for free on our internet site and also distributed for free, but some of our publications we have to sell due to a statutory catch, I would say, that we have to also generate income. Another bit special situation that we face. Now, I want to go to my second point and tell you a little bit how we in general collect information. And now I'm changing for a short while into another person, namely my colleague who heads the Department for Markets and Financing, André Lange, who some of you know and have worked with. And I will try to present you just 3 examples, and they're really only examples, as to how he contributes to the collection of information that matters for media pluralism. And here on the first slide, you see the distribution of financial resources, which is, of course, a major factor. And this here is more precisely on the evolution of advertising expenses. And what you see is that there was quite a crisis in 2008 and 2009, and that now there is a certain recovery, and that there is different impact on different media. And you can say that and you see it also that the internet market share, it's the slight green one, has risen, and it's continuing in this trend, while newspapers and magazines have been mostly affected by the crisis. And actually, the new data will more or less that are about to be released will show the continuation of the trend. This is one of, I believe, the very important issues when you talk about media and impact on pluralism. How do they finance themselves, and how is the shifting of money from one part of the media to possibly another? But that's not all. I mean, we are now getting back to certain issues that we had over the past hours, yesterday and today. You have the public service broadcasters as a very special kind of media where you could have an indication for pluralistic content. And what you see here is the daily audience market share of the public channels in several European countries. And you can see that there is quite a variation depending on what country you're looking at. The share remains stable in the UK and Germany, but for example in Italy and in Spain and in France you have a decline of the audience share. And smaller countries, you have one, Denmark is very much at the top, and Romania on the contrary, it's very much at the bottom. I mean, these are data to explain a little bit how things work in Europe, and also if you go beyond now a national approach, but for national you might have similar graphs. We try to give people the advantage to be able to compare across European countries how the market evolves, and you may then draw whatever conclusions you want from that. This part we don't engage in anymore. And the last small slide, which is almost explaining itself, it's the number of TV channels provided by leading media groups in the EU. And without going here in any further detail, you see we have some real big groups who are American-based, American-controlled, and these are the main suppliers in the TV market. So this is the kind of information, as I said, that you can regularly get from the observatory in the form of publication, mainly of the yearbook, but also other publications. Now I'm moving on to my own field and show you what you can get there regularly. I talked yesterday about a database that we have, which is to be understood in conjunction with a monthly newsletter where we update you on all the legal developments in Europe that matter to the audiovisual sector. And they then later go into the database, which is also fed from other sources. And there you have the little button for topics. And I have just here randomly chosen diversity, pluralism, and you come up with a whole series of articles. And of course, media pluralism might just be an aspect of the development, because a new media regulation put in place often has a provision that matters for media pluralism, and then this would of course also be classified as such. But it's here you see we have a total of 1,103 articles where at least media pluralism played a role in the development which is described. So this is also something which could be of use to really orient yourself as to what's going on and how do states, how actively are they involved in this very topic. Another resource for this is a series that we have. You could think of it in forms of a legal journal. We publish it 6 times a year. It's the Iris Plus series. And here I've only collected those latest Iris Pluses that deal with media pluralism, some aspects of that, if you so want. And again, I was very pleased yesterday to see that almost all of these topics have been mentioned. Now, what do you find in these articles? You find explanations of the legal framework, be it the European legal framework, the framework of some national laws that explain how do people see the problem of the digital dividend, for example. Who gets the spectrum that is freed? How much is pluralism a consideration in this regard? That's not the only issue that's explored, but it's one of the issues, of course. Similarly, we had just a couple of minutes ago the net neutrality. There too, what are the rules that are in place already or that might be discussed, that internet capacity should not discriminate against a particular group, but should be rather fostering freedom of information, and so on and so forth. So if you look at this series, you will also find ample of information as to media pluralism. Now that's for the general part. Now I move on to what I was really asked to do. Yes. Yeah, but I think it showed really yesterday that it's so complex that sometimes we feel, at least, it's better to cut out certain aspects, look at them, understand them, and then you go back to your general scheme and see, what have I learned from that? How does that fit in? I really think this is the only way how you can tackle this enormous topic of media pluralism. You cannot make just one scheme, and actually this is precisely what we have now also in mind here. You see, we like to add another term to media concentration, media pluralism. I'm right now conducting a study on regulation of market power. And for me, the aspect is very important. We had this today also on several occasions. How does this all work in terms of regulation in a converged and a connected audiovisual media sector? So this will be a book at the end of the year available, I hope, has 2 parts. One will talk about the EU law that is in place and that tries to get a grasp of market power regulation. It's mainly case law. And the other part is that we have selected the countries where you see here the acronyms to demonstrate some national legal frameworks. And what responses, if you so want, the regulators or the legislators have found to address the specific question of market power in this new environment. Now, what's the background? How did we come up with this study? We had in 2001 an Irish special on television and media concentration, where we looked at the national anti-concentration rules and also the competition law framework around it. And I think we've all seen that we are debating how much time do we have to continue with the framework which there is, and that's in a way also the starting point for our project, because 11 years later, at least a lot of the rules in place don't speak anymore about broadcasting. They speak now about audiovisual media services. That's the leading term. That's a term which is also justified because a lot of things have happened in the industry, in the business models, in the consumer behavior we just heard, and then naturally, possibly already also in the legal framework. And that's exactly what we want to find out. What has happened already or is about to happen in the legal framework? So contrary to a lot of projects that were presented, we don't have a theory that we want to prove or that we want to, put forward so that it could be applied to media pluralism. We want to understand what's going on. Where are we? We do stock taking in a way. And therefore maybe help then your legal theory so that you have some underpinning for your theories. Now, the first thing is to understand how market power is or can be established. The other one is that we don't look anymore at the market, but I think we have to comprehend more the audiovisual sector as a value chain and see that depending on when you are a business, where you do what in content production, in putting together services, in distribution, you have many ways of influencing your market position. And every reasonable business will do so. So we need, before we understand the rules, we have to see what are possibly triggering points. And then we have to, of course, make sure that whatever we do, we can still come up with a publication that's readable and understandable. And this I put first in my next slide. How do we try to do that? And again, we are back to a lot of things we discussed yesterday. We need to have a clear focus. So in a way, we focus, this is a clear decision, on negative state intervention. So not on what you could also do, of course, all the programs where state aid is given to develop pluralism. Now, this is a problematic choice also, even though we cannot do otherwise, because for the state aid and other promotional programs, we have other publications. But it's important, and that will be my task to write a very long explicit forward on that, these systems are interlinked. A lot of states make choices. It's the carrot and stick approach. It's not that they have negative intervention per se. No, how much they have and how they have it depends on how, on the other side, they use their stimulating measures to promote pluralism. There might be more or less need then thereafter to intervene. So one has to understand those two things are linked, but we have taken the liberty to say, okay, we can only do so much at the time we look only at the negative intervention. Now, that was very important. The other thing is you can foster pluralism, of course, also through content obligation that really look at the output only. This would, for example, be the quota provisions in the directive and things like that. We leave that also to other times and other publications. There's much more written about that than about the other area, the remaining ones. And then we focus, of course, not on, we want major case law, we cannot present everything, that's clear. And we have selected countries with big markets, because that's very important, what they put forward as regulated, and a lot of follow, but also to see, for example, EFTA countries, how does this work if you're not an EU member? That's why we have Switzerland, for example, inside. Norway is right now very much struggling with the fact whether they have to redo their media concentration law in light of the new media and the vertical approaches of the industry. So we put Norway in, and we have, of course, also tried to get an East-West balance. This matters because a lot of the media concentration law in the Western countries is old. You said the German is 16 years old. I wasn't aware that it's that old, but you will, of course, not find that history and tradition in Eastern European states. So that was also important to think about a certain selection. Now, just, I should also say we are really, really at the beginning of the study. I mean, we have made a very detailed outline to guide the correspondence, the national correspondence, without caging them too much into a system, because we are aware that the national situations are so different that some things work in one country, but they don't work in the other. So you have to give some liberty, but you have to guide them, because if not, the thing as a whole composition makes no sense. It doesn't give you anymore an idea about where the trends are, what common rules are, what common problems are. So we try to be a bit flexible there and to have a mix. Now, when you have this idea of a value chain, maybe the first thing you sometimes have to consider is really what is the situation as to market entry. I mean, where do some industry people team up in order to strengthen their own position, and what is the situation as to getting a license to be at all present in the market. So these are things that we will have to ask, obviously. We think, so we had an interesting discussion yesterday evening, that copyright will increasingly matter, because you have so many media outlets. Content will become maybe the new scarce resource. So some broadcaster might look like it already is. And how powerful you are as to negotiating copyright, of also withholding content where you own copyrights, because you might not have yourself the service to promote it, but you don't want your enemy to have it, or your competitor, I should say. How you deal with public service broadcasting archives, whether or not they shall be opened and to whom. And there are lots of ways how you can use copyright within the limits of what is economically reasonable and still position yourself well. So this is going to be something we'll ask: is there a regulation that takes that into account? Is this a real problem? Is this considered as a problem? And so on. And then, of course, the vertical organizations of companies. I mean, broadcasters have their own production companies, but they might more and more also have their own distribution system. And there is so much in the vertical organization that's maybe one of the most interesting concentration issues, but also the other classical ones, horizontal, diagonal concentration, are going into similar markets where you more or less serve the same customers. That's what we had today. What's the difference whether I see television on my computer screen or whether I have it on the iPod? So, I mean, there's a lot that we could consider here. Then the economic power, that leads us back to the slides of Entree that I showed you. Advertising revenues, how are they distributed? Maybe can somebody impose for his services tariffs, and that are more favorable to some than to others. And then we have really also a lot of new gatekeepers, potential gatekeepers, especially the equipment manufacturers will play an increasing role in the converged and connected world, where you have a power just by how you construct the machines, whom you give access to or not. I mean, that might remind some of you, and I think rightfully so, of certain Microsoft software where you were in the system, you lived with the system, with all the upgrades, all the bugs, it was your world. It didn't talk to other worlds. And equipment is very, very powerful in the same sense. But you have also EPGs, you have set-top boxes, you have all sorts of control mechanisms where they could play a role into how you establish yourself on the market. And I'm not saying, I really don't want to be misunderstood. I think it's legitimate for the industry to do that. They are in a competitive world. They have to find out what is best for them. But I think, as regulator, you then want to know where do we need to intervene because somebody is simply overdoing it, or some markets do need, for whatever reason, regulation. So now I'm only showing you, this was the wrong button, it's this one. The questionnaire is basically then composed of the different value chain levels, if you so want, and it's really interesting because you come back to understand that things are so intertwined that you tend to bring up almost all the issues in the first category when you start with the services, where you will have to see what is particularly done in a country as to the public service media, market entry, then the specific anti-concentration rules, the ownership rules. You see a couple of buzzwords. And then we understand that competition law is always around, but I think in most countries it has more a complementing effect to the media-specific rules for audiovisual media services and the enabling services. Then you have always some key issues that have always been there. They haven't gone away, like must offer or the archives. And you have possibly, but possibly not, that's what we're asking, specific rules for enabling or facilitating services. I mean, do they already exist? We want to know. And then on the next level, we look at platform operators and converged services, so especially also aggregating sites is certainly one of these issues, video hosting sites, and we will have to look in the various combinations of how you can converge services. And again, the question is not only how do you define those new markets, but also what is with the already media-specific anti-concentration rules that exist. Are they extended in some countries to these new services? Are they already in? So you gave, in a way, a German answer already to that is not so much important. Look at the new services right now, but you are in the process of developing. So this is what we want to know also from other countries. And again, of course, the competition law is always the layer that it's sometimes even a catch-all clause that we have to also handle. And then last but not least, of course, the network operators. So there are also specific rules. The telecoms package is, of course, important to see what have also the latest changes brought about. And again, definition of markets, tariffs, and the whole bunch, and always to complete it by competition law. So it's a very refined questionnaire almost that we have tried to get to the authors with the clear understanding. Just think of whether any of that matters already in your country, has triggered a court case, has triggered some legislative proposal, or is already alive in some law. And then what we also, of course, have to do is to look at the EU level, where you have similar problems, but where I want to highlight in particular that it's important to see how regulation of market entry might conflict with the fundamental freedoms. And they can be economic, or they can, of course, also be the freedom of information. And I think there is a real need also to look into how does the EU competition law build in these worries and these aspects. And then again, also where do we stand with must offer, must carry, and the telecoms package? What are there any signals as to how the Commission might then work with the new services and apply it to them? So that's the program. Our correspondents are working on it as we speak. And what do I hope to find? Actually, I do think some might. We want to see. In the end, we will have to make an analysis. I cannot tell you much what will be the outcome, because I first have to see what the input is, obviously. But I hope that I get some answers as to justification for media-specific regulation in a converged environment. You know, that an issue we just discussed. And there was, of course, the scope of the anti-concentration rules. And the markets, I mean, are we still able, and how do we define markets? How do countries do that? And then what's the impact of other areas I gave you for most the copyright area, which have so far not really been within our radar screens? And what do they add to all of this? And then all of this I can work on, I hope, in June, and comes the usual publication process. And we might add on, depending on how much time Entree has and how much money we have for translation, some information indeed on the market situation of the countries we are looking at. And then we have to have this more or less ready in November, at the end of the year at the latest, because of the budgetary planning at the observatory. So stay tuned. I hope we'll have very interesting results soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Let's stop here and have the coffee break, if not it gets too late for the coffee break, and then we'll reconvene in 15 minutes, okay?
Coffee break is in
yeah.